I don't need to introduce you, Daron. We consider you almost part of the World Bank. Yeah. So you can take all the time you want. I think we have the schedule for how long? An hour and a half? Okay. So speak as long as you like.
I'll speak for 35 minutes or so.
Good. Because there'll be lots of questions. And by the way, there are lots of people online too.
Yeah.
And so we'll take questions online.
We'll do both online and offline questions.
Yep. Thank you.
I'll go up there.
Let me get you something to put that on. We haven't figured this out yet.
Yes. That.
We need to get these cans that are slanted.
This seems sort of balanced. No, it's okay. I think
Just
it's
in case, yeah.
all right. Just in case. All right. Let's do that. All right. Okay. I have to stay close to this mic. Let's give a few more minutes for people to come in.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've heard that we have made a very good hire from the University of Chicago, formerly of MIT. His name is Ufuk Ashigit.
Oh, yes.
And he's going to be joining here.
He's going to be a permanent employee of the World Bank?
That's a plan.
Wow.
That's
okay.
a plan. Yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
You have to tie him down here.
Yes. So we have a strategy for that, by the way.
All right. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. And I know some of you might think not yet another talk on AI, but hopefully I'll be able to share some ideas that are not entirely the ones that you read in newspapers. And the title probably says what I want to sort of convey in a very concise form, that while AI is obviously a very promising and transformative technology, not all is well. And in particular, I'm going to argue that the direction of AI is not the one that's socially beneficial more broadly, and certainly not in line with the interests or economic flourishing of developing countries, which obviously are topics that people at the World Bank think a lot about. So, okay, this is not changing. I don't know what's going on here. All right, something's weird. Okay, at least that's changing. So AI, as many of you, of course, firmly believe, has tremendous potential. The things that AI is now capable of doing, especially generative models, but it goes beyond just generative models, are beyond things that most people would have forecast a decade ago. And even the early models, GPT 3.5, GPT-4, and associated models from Google, showed reasonable improvements over things that humans can do. For example, coding, writing tasks, customer service, help for consulting activities. And typically, those capabilities have gotten better, especially with agentic AI over the last 6 months, especially in coding, but also a variety of other tasks. So how much it will reduce costs is very much dependent on what kind of projections you make for the future. But a lot of that reduction, at least at the moment, is associated with automation, meaning the capability of these models to replace human labor in a variety of tasks. So even in places where you might think there is more of a collaboration, such as in writing tasks, at the end, what the models are able to do is take over some of the things like first drafts or proofs reading, etc., that humans used to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. There is a lot of things that humans do that's routine, boring, not so great use of human skills. But if AI goes purely in an automation direction, I will argue this will not just squander the potential, but also have various social consequences that are not desirable. But before we do that, let's put this, okay, all right. So I have to change it on both. Okay, no. Okay, this is where AI would be useful. To coordinate what's going on between this computer and the screen, which doesn't seem to work. Right, we need a human, exactly. No, still not. That just made it off. That was on already. So that changes it here, but it doesn't change on the screen.
How about this? Let me see.
No, it's changing it here. So it's not. Okay. It's between here and the screen, somehow. Okay. Well, let me continue to talk, and the slides will follow. So, in fact, a lot of what AI does at the moment, though much beyond the capabilities of early digital technologies, there is continuity, both in terms of where the promise lies and in terms of the direction of travel. And it was well before AI that we have seen a tremendous explosion in the number of innovations, apps, new technologies based on the digital platform. And if you had my slides up here, you would see that in the United States, for example, if you look at the patents filed with the USPTO, they have quadrupled from 1980, and almost all of that increase is accounted for by two sectors, electronics and electrics and electronics. That's where a lot of the machinery is, and software or information.
So is your general thesis...
That's good. Jump in.
So is your general thesis that countries should avoid AI?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not. So we put that one to rest. Okay, perfect. So now we just need to make it big. Perfect. Yep. All right. Thank you so much. So on the left, you are seeing in green the number of patents, and the orange and the blue is where that increase is coming from, where you see the share of patents in those two sectors just explode. But at least the way that economists measure it, total factor productivity, the digital age has not been tremendous. Total factor productivity growth in previous decades used to average above 2%, sometimes 3%, and it has hardly reached 1% during the digital age. So the question is whether AI can avoid that. So one of the great promises of AI is a productivity revolution, in particular in places where previous digital technologies couldn't reach, such as healthcare and education. But the direction of change is quite overlapping with earlier technologies. So a lot of the improvements in digital technologies from 1980s were in the automation domain, in the manufacturing process, dedicated advanced machinery and robotics, and in offices based on software systems, for example. Now, productivity, of course, is only one of the things that we would care about. The other is about what happens to wages so that we have some sense of who benefits and who loses from AI or from other digital technologies. And the other one is in the domain of jobs. So automation in that regard hasn't been a tremendous success. This is for the US, where because of weakness of other labor market institutions, the effects are most visible or perhaps jarring. So on the left and in the middle, I'm showing you the evolution of inequality in the labor market, wages by education and gender. What you see from the 1960s to the mid-1970s is what we would normally call shared prosperity, because real wages for different demographic groups are growing more or less in tandem. But from around the late 1970s, early 1980s, you have a complete sea change where wages for highly educated workers, for example, those with postgraduate degrees in dark blue, continue to increase, while those for lower education workers, orange, for example, those with less than high school, green for those with a high school degree, or the black, which is for people with community colleges and associate degrees, you see sustained declines in real wages. So this is not just an increase in inequality, but a complete breakdown of shared prosperity in the US labor market. And of course, something like this, that's so transformative and once in several generation change in the wage structure in the United States has many causes, from ranging from globalization to institutional changes. But my research argues that one of the main drivers of this change has been automation. So in particular, again, the use of digital technologies for replacing workers, replacing tasks that workers used to perform. So that's the message of the rightmost figure, which is from work that I've done with Pascual Restrepo. What I'm doing there is that rather than looking at the time series, I am focusing on that critical period from 1980 to about 2014-15, where this big increase in inequality takes place, and just looking at the cumulative change by demographic group during this 35-year period. And I'm also shifting the focus from the 10 demographic groups distinguished by gender and education, to more detailed groups distinguished by gender, education, age, and ethnicity. You can see that, again, wage performance during this period has been abysmal, from the fact that the zero line there, which is a little faint, but zero line cuts those observations right in the middle. About half of those dots are below the zero line, which means that about half of the demographic groups in the United States have experienced no wage gain, in fact, wage losses in real terms since 1980 or 1980 to the 2015. There has been faster wage growth for low age groups since 2015, which is an interesting phenomenon. But the more interesting part is the horizontal axis, which is Pascual Restrepo and my measure of how much exposure to automation different demographic groups have. Loosely speaking, it's the fraction of tasks that each demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been potentially automated, meaning the automation technologies for them exist. So you can see that for some group that's like 20% of the tasks that they used to perform, 25% of the tasks that they used to perform are now automated. These are mostly lower education groups which used to work in manufacturing, for example, especially heavy manufacturing where robotics made big advances. And notably, a lot of that between group inequality changes are accounted for this just one single automation variable, about 50 to 70% of it, depending on what other covariates you include in there. So automation has been a very, very major part of the story. And, optimism is the name we give to doing exactly the same thing and hoping for a different outcome. So when people say, well, automation is going to lift everybody, we should at least think about why is it that things are going to be different this time. And in some sense, shouldn't be a surprise that automation has had such far-reaching effects on inequality, because what automation entails is displacing workers from what they used to do, and to the extent that different groups of workers have comparative advantages that differ, and you are displaced from the jobs for which you had a comparative advantage, that's going to have a heavy toll on your earnings and job prospects. And the same picture is true if you look at not just wages. I'm not going to show you that, but it's also true when you look at jobs. So those are the groups that lose jobs or their employment to population ratios decline, etc. So the question is, well, are we getting all of this automation because that's the only or the most efficient thing to do? Or is there a dimension of choice where we can reasonably question the direction of digital technologies and more recently of AI? Or in other words, can we be sure that the market necessarily will get the direction of new technologies right? So I think it's very reasonable, as an economist, to start with a presumption that the market's going to get certain things right. And if we're talking about market for apples and oranges or coffee, I think most of us would have fairly strong priors that the market's roughly getting it right. But innovation, especially the direction of technology, is a very different beast. It's not exogenous, although many approaches in economics sometimes assume that they do. And much of public debate assumes that it does because AI is something happening to us. It also takes it inevitable that such developments will happen. Again, that may not be inevitable at all because technology is an endogenous outcome. And there is also a presumption in much of economics that technological developments are always beneficial for society, perhaps after an initial period of adjustment. None of that is necessarily true, as the automation pictures that I showed earlier on illustrate. And because technological changes have far-reaching effects and externalities, knowledge externalities are baked into technological change and innovation. Monopoly and business stealing are de rigueur, so much of what motivates Silicon Valley, for example, is entering into new businesses and disrupting existing businesses. That's the business stealing. So all of those things create major first-order welfare effects on people who are not part of the decisions, hence are externalities, and optimality isn't assured. And there are also major interactions between existing market structures, for example, whether workers are in unionized sectors or whether they're receiving efficiency wages, etc., and the displacement costs, which again could create important sources of distortions. And also relevant, and not unnoticed by people in this room, I'm sure, is that what is decided in Silicon Valley may be completely suboptimal for Nigeria or India or Indonesia, which is another dimension in which the market will certainly not get it right globally. And given the transformative nature of AI and potential importance, so on that one, I am completely sold with the Silicon Valley motto that AI is going to transform everything, it is imperative that we take these issues seriously and at least think through their implications rather than sort of give in to some sort of naive market fundamentalism. So the question is, what are the reasons for suspecting, or at least thinking through, that the market may not get it right? Which ones have evidence and what we can do about it? I think to lay that scene, the first thing we need to understand is what are the capabilities of AI and what are the options, what is the menu for choices for the direction of AI, both in terms of design and in terms of applications. And here, of course, there is no complete agreement. Some AI scientists, notably Geoffrey Hinton, who, is deservedly called sometimes the grandfather of AI, were motivated in working in neural nets and deep learning because they thought this is how the human brain works. And in fact, there is indeed a superficial similarity in multi-layer networks and the human brain. But when you think about it, the nature of, I would argue, again, not completely uncontroversial, but the nature of human intelligence and artificial intelligence are very different. And one way you can think about that is, what are the things that humans are good at that models are not, and what are the things in which AI models are good and humans are not? So human intelligence is very much based on what you would call one-shot learning and trial and error. So if you think of the way, for example, children learn language, they do not start from a large database and try to fit a pattern. So in that sense, the Geoffrey Hinton presumption isn't exactly right. There may be neural connections, but they are based on existing modules, as most famously argued by Noam Chomsky, for example, which then get activated in specific direction. There is a continuous process of trial and error where children experiment with language, they see reactions, they imitate, etc. So this is a very different kind of learning, especially when you take into account that it's aided by multiple pathways of biological sensory inputs. So we don't just learn with our brain, we use our entire body, sense, guts, etc. And a lot of this is very relevant for creativity, because these multiple pathways are very important for filtering different thoughts. So creativity is generating crazy ideas and then filtering those that are really crazy against those that could be useful. If you compare this to machine intelligence, while there is something called one-shot learning and reinforcement learning, it is very different in its nature from the one-shot trial and error way that humans do. On the other hand, the machines are excellent at things that humans suck at. For example, even the smartest human, give them one volume of the British Encyclopedia Britannica and tell them to read it and summarize it, they wouldn't be able to do it. That's just too much information, and humans are not very good at taking large amounts of information, finding the relevant ones, calibrating it to different context, and retaining all of it, etc. The models are also very, very good at doing things fast. Again, much, much faster than humans would ever be able to do. But on the other hand, as of now, they don't have one-shot learning capabilities or creativity filters that would qualify. So that's why when machines hallucinate, it's really bad. When humans hallucinate, that's really good. If Einstein hadn't hallucinated, we wouldn't have general relativity. So what that suggests is that these two things are very different. If two things are different, one basic principle of economics would be to use them together in a complementary fashion. It would be a fool's errand to try to get one to do all of the business of the other. So for those of you who are basketball fans, of course Michael Jordan was a better player than Dennis Rodman and Scottie Pippen, but Phil Jackson would have gone down in the history of basketball as the worst coach in history if he asked Michael Jordan to do everything while Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman sat on the bench. So you want to exploit the complementarity between the two different intelligences. How would you do that? The way you would do that is by using AI to generate new capabilities, new tasks, new expertise for workers, which is what I call pro-worker AI. Now, in this, I am decidedly building on the shoulders of giants, because there is a line in computer science, which is now eclipsed, but I'll come back to that, which is all about this. So Norbert Wiener, a very famous engineer and mathematician, some of you may have heard of him from the Wiener processes, started writing on this topic in the late 1940s. And Norbert Wiener's journey to this was very similar to the one that I'm actually describing here, because he started thinking about these problems because he was worried about robots. So, the concerns about robots are not recent. They go back to the first half of the 20th century, at least. But Wiener was very worried about robots, especially if robots became advanced, what that would imply for shared prosperity, wages, etc. And he argued that the better way of using digital technologies was in a symbiotic way with human skills. But the two people who actually made even bigger advances are there. One is J.C.R. Licklider, who, if we're naming grandfathers, should be the grandfather of the internet, because it was his prototypical design, which the ARPANET adopted and essentially became the packet switching is J.C.R. Licklider's idea. But Licklider was himself a hands-on engineer and also a leader, as for example, when he took over DARPA. But even more interestingly, in 1960, I guess 61, 60, he wrote this article, which I quote there, but it may be too small on the screen, where he said, well, in not so distant future, we're going to see a revolution whereby human machines and computers are going to be coupled together, and you're going to see something that would not have been possible by either of them by itself. You're going to have much better information for humans coming from computers, and computers getting much more effective because they are being used by humans. So that was the promise that J.C.R. Licklider saw. Of course, when he wrote, that was impossible. It remained impossible in 1917, 1918, 1990, 2000, 2010. But generative AI actually makes that a feasible possibility, because that capability that I mentioned, which is sifting through very large amount of data, actually enables computers to provide much better information in real time in a reliable manner that would expand what humans can do. This was also the agenda that another engineer who probably contributed even more than anybody else to this kind of technologies, Douglas Engelbart, who called this human-machine complementarity, so human-computer complementarity, and designed many of the technologies that we take for granted. They were all in the service of making computers much more usable and much more effective in the hands of humans. So the mouse is his invention. That's the first mouse there you see there in 1968, which Engelbart demonstrated in a demo which he called mother of all demos. Hyperlinks, hypertext, menu-driven computers, all of them were Douglas Engelbart's inventions. Now, what we can do along the lines of Licklider and Engelbart is exactly combine human intelligence and machine intelligence so that humans get much better at decision making, problem identification, information retrieval, filtering, which again, as I said, they are pretty good at filtering, but they can be better because they don't have the background information for many things. And that would enable humans make much better decisions, solve much more complex problems, and venture into new things. This is actually, by the way, exactly what the AI industry tells us will happen to science. So when there is the promise of things like AlphaFold happening, that's what would perhaps enable biologists or medical researchers to do things that they couldn't do before. Actually, with protein solving, they could do them, but they could do them much more slowly. But the idea is there. In principle, AI can do that much more broadly, and that's where creating new tasks for workers rather than automation comes in. So rather than try to replace a teacher or an electrician, imagine an AI tool that expands what teachers can do, so that there's much more personalized, effective teaching, but led by teachers, not students talking to chatbots. Or rather than trying to automate electrical work, which remains completely impossible, I think, in the near future, imagine AI tools that help electricians diagnose all sorts of problems and understand the interplay between different types of machinery and do things much more effectively and faster, as well as improve training. So these kinds of applications are actually within the frontier of AI, and so it's not like I'm not making a statement here about there could be some, pie in the sky in the future. In fact, there are prototypes for all of these technologies that I'm talking about.
So I just want to make a quick comment, Daron. So far you've been very reassuring, unless I missed something while I was eating and you said something that markets wouldn't do right, or so far you haven't made a case for...
I am coming to that. Yes.
Okay.
I'm coming to that. So the bitter pill is coming. So before I get to the bitter pill, here is why a list of things that, in summary, why I think complementarity is so important. First of all, I think the promise of productivity gains from complementarity are at least as real as productivity gains from automation. It is, of course, possible that we reach AGI and then after that artificial superintelligence very quickly, and computers can do everything and we have boundless productivity. So I cannot rule that out, obviously, nobody can, but I don't see that as a very likely outcome. And if the recent past is any guide, attempts to automate have not yielded very large productivity gains. There are very good reasons for that. Automation is actually very hard because you're trying to change the division of labor and change the nature of occupations when you try to take some tasks away. The reason why AGI would work is because it would be so good that it can wholesale automate whole occupations. But most of the time that's not feasible. So you need to take some tasks, but then integrating those tasks with what else is done in that occupation is very hard. Integrating them into organizations is really, really hard. Whereas if you actually make electricians, nurses, teachers, plumbers, manufacturing workers more productive, that's an immediate, improvement in productivity. If you make them productive twice, that's a doubling of productivity. As I have argued, you would get much better wage and employment outcomes. While it is true that automation does increase average productivity because you're cutting labor, it doesn't improve marginal productivity. In fact, reduces the marginal product of labor. So that's why there is a downward pressure on the wages of displaced workers. Whereas pro-worker AI complementarity would potentially increase marginal productivity because you're expanding what workers do. As a result, when you look at history, you see that periods in which there has been rapid productivity growth going hand in hand with employment and wage growth are often associated with these kinds of human complementarity or tasks. So there I have a picture from Henry Ford's, one of his first factories, the Rouge plant in 1919. Of course, Henry Ford was a leader in automation by introducing electrical machinery, but he was also a leader in completely changing the production process and introducing a whole amount of engineering, new tasks, new skills, new technical capabilities for workers. That's why whenever you see pictures of Ford factories, you don't see just machinery, you see machinery working with labor. So that's the reason why the automobile industry became the fastest growing employee in the United States during that period. Better social outcomes. I didn't mention that, but changes in wage inequality, job loss, displacement have coincided with tremendously bad social outcomes. We've seen that both from the displacement from Chinese imports and also from automation that went on in the Midwest, for example, when there is a large number of workers losing their jobs, community structure collapses, various outcomes get worse, such as teenage pregnancies, out of wedlock births, and opioid use are some of the most well-measured outcomes of that. In general, there is also much less political engagement. Electoral turnout turns south, and polarization increases as a result of these things. So better citizenry is typically associated with better employment and wage possibilities for workers. The world is in actually great need of new goods and services. I think this is, again, should be much clearer to World Bank than many American policy think tanks, because the developing world is changing rapidly. Climate change, demographic change, new urbanization, new industrialization are all changing demand patterns, and many of the prevailing challenges haven't been resolved. For example, we've been talking about financial inclusion for, 3 decades and very little progress. Why? Because I think we need new goods and services. Unless, again, you reach artificial superintelligence and AI models themselves become so creative as they can invent anything, you need human creativity. And then, so if you have complementarity, you're giving better tools for humans to do exactly the things that they can do, which is innovate and come up with new goods and services. And also, we can create better and new platforms, but let me not talk about that. So now I come to Indramit's question. So if there is this potential for complementarity, if it's socially beneficial, and if it really does generate productivity gains, well, shouldn't we expect the market to get it right? And I'm going to go through the argument that there are many reasons that empirically detectable for why we shouldn't bank on the market that much. First of all, oh, thank you. I still have some, but yeah, you can leave it there. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Gabby. If there are better social outcomes from complementarity, no business will take those into account. So the social outcomes that follow are just a externality. So that's one place where the market will necessarily not get it right. Second, we have policy distortions that would directly encourage automation. The United States, most industrialized nations, and some developing nations massively subsidize capital and tax labor. So in the United States, for example, estimates that I had with Pascual Restrepo and Andrea Manera suggest that when you hire a worker as an employer, on average, you pay a 25% tax. That's a lower bound. It could be actually much higher, about 30%, but at least 25%. If you hire a digital equipment, or if you buy a digital equipment, the user cost is heavily subsidized, so much so that now it's close to zero, and for the last 25 years, it's been less than or around 5%. So that creates about the 20% or more wedge that is a subsidy to automation ahead of using labor. And it also affects very massively employers' incentives to invest in workers, for example, through training.
But so far, you still haven't made a case against the market. You just made a case against the government.
Well, the social one is a case against the market.
You're saying that you have this policy. The first exhibit that you gave is a clear case where the government should be either taxing them at the same rate.
That's right. But the first one that I said here, which is the social outcomes, will not be internalized by the market.
But you asserted that, no? You didn't show that. In the other case, you showed, you didn't assert the other part. You actually showed.
Well, for the social ones, I don't need to show. It's not internalized. Which market structure takes into account impact on communities?
Okay. I'll think of something.
All right, please do. The other thing, which again, Indramit might say, I'm asserting, I'm not just going to show, is that business models matter for the direction of innovation. So in particular, what I mean by that is that companies typically have a given business model around which they're organized. And that business model has an immediate impact on how they develop or how they want to develop technologies. So a lot of the digital industry developed as software provider to large businesses, which is very very synergistic with automation, because you can prepare automation tools and then sell them to businesses. And that's what Microsoft, Oracle, and various other companies were very good at. That doesn't preclude new business models coming in, but as Arrow's replacement effect or Christensen's innovator's dilemma emphasizes, those are disruptive innovations or entries coming from new players. So the question is, will this process take place smoothly? And typically it doesn't take place smoothly. Incumbents could be quite powerful. And I'll come back to that. The second way in which the tech industry has made money is through control of information. And by that's a somewhat grandiose term, but it's essentially, if you think about it, this is what collecting information about users and then selectively deploying that for example, algorithmic feed or algorithmic services is all about that control of information. Now, that is a very, very successful business model. It's been very difficult to disrupt, but it's also quite pernicious in terms of its effects. In particular, a lot of the ills that are now much better documented in terms of mental health, in terms of polarization, decline in social interactions, etc., that follow from social media are directly linked to algorithmic use of information. So a lot of this kind of effect was impossible or was much more muted before social media started algorithmic feeds, for instance. Now, both of those could be disrupted if you have better technologies, but those better technologies need to coalesce around new business models that then disrupt the existing equilibrium. Now, that has become much, much harder. The US market has reached levels of concentration that are pretty high by historic standards, but the tech sector has reached really unheard of levels of concentration. So 7 companies today account for 60% of all of NASDAQ. And just to give you a sense, if you take each one of these 7 companies, their annual revenues are twice inflation adjusted the total GDP of the British Empire in the middle of the 19th century. That includes India and Ramit.
As long as they're competing with each other, though, it's okay, right?
May or may not be.
Okay.
Then we need to look into the I/O. For example, competition may take the wrong form, that you may all race for something that's not so socially beneficial. But yes, and moreover, I think that's where a lot of antitrust is. So it's a good topic to have a debate on. They're sometimes competing, sometimes colluding. But the point that I want to make next, perhaps, is the most controversial for economists. For any choice about the direction of technology for a general purpose technology, but especially for AI, also ideology matters. So in economics, we take it for granted that decisions are going to be made in a profit maximizing manner. Because of monopoly externalities, those may not coincide with the first best, or there may be policy distortions, as Indramit called out. But left to its own devices without these imperfections, you're going to make the right decisions. That's not guaranteed when it comes to forward-looking decisions about technology. So if you think of AI, for example, much of AI investment today is being justified by prospects of much bigger profits in 10 years' time. So there isn't an exact market feedback that says, that's the right profit maximizing decision. So it's really the beliefs of the leading players and the venture capitalists and a few other people like private equity money. Private equity has been very big in AI. So that really determines what gets done. And we say, well, this is the profitable direction. This is the natural direction. Therefore, it's fine for these companies to lose $50 or $100 billion a year. We're still going to finance them. So where is that ideology? That ideology is actually what eclipsed what I mentioned from the Wiener-Licklider-Engelbart perspective. So while those innovations were important for early digital technologies, pretty much the entire industry is today, and the entire field of computer science today, is influenced much more by a different one, which goes back to Turing, and then became the rallying cry of the AI industry, for example, in the Dartmouth project in 1956, the picture of which is up there, which was the place where the AI was christened and perhaps arguably started. So Turing was obviously an amazingly brilliant mathematician, and a lot of his big breakthroughs were in the area of computation. But then out of that, he took a big leap, and he argued that whenever the human cognition is involved, that's a type of computation. The substrate in which that computation takes place doesn't matter. Hence, if there is a universally best computer, which is what we call a universal Turing machine today, which is a machine that can compute anything that's computable, that will necessarily be superior in terms of cognition, knowledge, capabilities to the human brain. That is the perspective that the AI community immediately swallowed hook, line, and sinker. That's why, as early as 1956, several of those gentlemen there were pronouncing that within 2 years, AI is going to be smarter than any human and can do anything that humans can do, etc. So that was a belief. It wasn't based on any data. Obviously, it was wrong. But it was a belief. It was a very strong ideology. It never died. In the 70s, people claimed the same thing. In the 1980s, people claimed the same thing. And in the 1990s and 2000s, this became even stronger and became the sort of the organizing theme of the entire AI industry, especially once unified with science fiction. Well, human complementary movies are not as exciting as killer robots, and all sorts of warnings about artificial intelligence soon arriving and becoming the dominion of humans, etc. So it is partly this ideology that's shaping the direction of AI. And you can see that, for example, when you contrast the US to China. While it is true that China has recently caught the AGI bug as well, especially with DeepSeek, but if you look at the center of gravity of AI, is much more practical in China than the United States. The center of gravity of AI research in the US is determined by this belief that everything goes through AGI. And that's why large language models are so big, and they try to be generalists, etc. Now, again, it may be right. The fact that something is ideological doesn't mean that it's wrong, but at least we have to recognize that there's an ideology here guiding it, and that ideology may not be in the best interests of everybody. Now, one other correction mechanism here could be science. So business models, ideology in the business sector may all push in one direction, but science is an autonomous process, and people are curious, people are going to investigate things, and if they do, and they gravitate towards human complementary pro-worker AI, and if there is the promise that I'm saying, perhaps that should happen. The problem is that while in the 2000s AI was entirely academically funded, today a trivial portion of it is academically funded. A vast majority is from the industry or industry collaborations. So the industry's preferences also fully determine what the academic research is about. So therefore, there is a bunch of directions which at least raise the possibility that the direction that we're choosing is not optimal, and there aren't any natural automatic correction mechanisms.
So, but if you go back to that chart, Daron, it could be a good thing that, right? So because as long as that green part was very big, that meant that this technology was still incipient.
Yes.
It wasn't yet ready to be implemented in the service of humanity. But now, as that orange part grows, you actually, that those technologies are being used for the service of humanity, right?
No, yeah, absolutely. So this picture by itself may be good or bad or neutral. But what I'm saying is that this picture throws cold water on the dream that science will somehow get it right. Science is not a disembodied process. It's embedded in who finances it, who sets the agenda, etc. And right now, the agenda for computer science research and AI is very much set in Silicon Valley. Now, all of these would be concerning for the US workers, US communities. But I think the stakes are much larger than that. The vast majority of the world's population lives in the developing world, and there is still a major poverty problem, even if the most extreme poverty, whatever it is, $2 a day, the threshold, it always shifts, has declined significantly. A lot of people are still near the poverty line around the world. And in addition, there is a tremendous appetite and need around the world for jobs and good jobs. So informal sector, for example, in Latin America, joblessness in some countries, lack of high-wage jobs in China and parts of Asia, all of those are linked. There is no experience, so far as I know, of a developing country growing in anything other than, oil wealth for United Arab Emirates, which has happened without creating jobs, and especially reasonable paying jobs. And that typically happens, not always, but typically happens either because countries are able to use technology to leverage their abundant factors in which they have competitive advantage for exports or for the internal market. So that's why there are a lot of similarities between the way that Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan grew, and China subsequently followed. If AI becomes as important as we suspect it to become and goes in an automation direction, that automation will not stop in US borders, obviously. First of all, the same technology will be exported everywhere. We're already seeing a lot of AI technologies cross borders. But secondly, AI will change the international division of labor. So, for example, recent research shows that when American auto industries adopt robots, that has not just an effect on U.S. productivity, U.S. employment, U.S. wages, but it completely reshaped the Mexican industry. So that's a microcosm of what will potentially happen with AI. So AI, therefore, if it goes in this automation direction, could preclude the possibility of creating jobs and good jobs for large populations. It may not be a big problem for countries like China, where there will be a major demographic shift towards smaller populations. But for Africa or other parts of Asia, I think it's a major, major problem. So that, to me, says that pro-worker AI would have much bigger positive potential in the developing world than even in the United States and Europe. And most importantly, or not most importantly, but equally importantly, you also need policy coordination at a global level, because at the end of the day, the direction of AI is going to impact, the 7 billion people who don't live in, or 6 billion people who don't live in China and the United States. But the same ideology and the race towards AGI and the market structure also preclude any say, not just for workers in the United States, but much, much more for anybody who lives in the developing world. So the current equilibrium is also faulty because it's going to impact the entire world without any input from the entire world. Now, to conclude, I think you might still put some stock in that even if the market doesn't get it right, there could be institutional and market responses that take a longer time, and that ultimately perhaps puts us onto a better path. I think that cannot be ruled out, but our historical experience suggests that it's not automatic and it could be very slow. So, for example, the British Industrial Revolution, which is sometimes cited as, well, things worked out so well in the British Industrial Revolution, so why are you worried about AI? Well, the reality is very different. The first 80 years or so of the British Industrial Revolution were horrible. Earnings were stagnant. Wages per hour were declining. Conditions deteriorated a lot. Children as young as 5 or 6 were working in coal mines. Life expectancy in cities like Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester fell to 30 years, and workers were completely alienated and became lost all of their autonomy in the process of industrialization in large factories. It took quite a long time for things to get better. Wages started increasing in the 1840s. Working conditions started increasing around the same time, but especially after 1870s. And new technologies came in a way that were much less unhealthy, much more inclusive in some ways. But none of that was automatic. For example, Britain went through one of the most transformative political changes, democratizing from being a very, very non-democratic country, starting in the 1832 First Reform Act. Trade unions that were completely banned and prosecuted heavily became legalized in the 1870s, and there was a complete change in the direction of technology with labs and with priorities changing, etc. But if it takes that long, even during the Industrial Revolution, it's not clear how long it would take and what the correction mechanism would be today. So therefore, that's the conclusion, that all is not well with AI. But if they want for a silver lining, all is not well in AI in a way that we can change. The reason for not being super optimistic is that making that change is hard, especially in a global economy in which 6 billion people have no input into this process. Thank you.
Got it. So you succeeded in making me think for the first time in a long time. But my first question.
I'm sure that's not.
No. So my essential first question is, given the fact that the AI revolution is not the first type of technology that leads to the kind of effects that you said, and as a result of it, what societies have done is that they have reacted to it by putting in place institutions like labor laws and other institutions, like essentially democracy, etc. Wouldn't it be the case that you and those mechanisms still exist? So it's not like they existed just after the Industrial Revolution, then they went away. Some of them did, but many of them still exist. So aren't we better prepared for another round of those technologies? Why would you look at that and say, well, for 80 years things were terrible and it's going to be the same way now? Maybe not, because we've actually not just learned, but we've actually changed the way what governments do, how society is organized, et cetera, as a result of that. That's one thing, right? The second thing is, you're an academic. By definition.
Therefore clueless.
No. By definition, you have more human intelligence per pound than the typical business person, right?
But they have a lot of pounds.
But see, the thing is that you resent the fact that they have something that you don't have as much of. They have more money per pound, okay? So you're saying you like the world where the rules are made by people who have more human intelligence per pound rather than people who have more money per pound. There's
okay,
nothing.
let me take that one.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that. But let me talk about your first question first. They both require somewhat long answers. So it is absolutely true that we have better democratic institutions. We have better laws. We have more information. We have more civic engagement pathways than were available in the 18th century or the beginning of the 19th century. That being said, all of these things were even more true in the 1980s, and I show you the picture of what happened in the 1980s. So that did not prevent 35 years of massive increase in inequality, in which many communities disintegrated, polarization increased. And I would argue that democracy functioned much better in 1980 than it does today. So at least on prima facie ground, there isn't a guarantee that our institutions are necessarily up to the task. In fact, it's another constant discussion within the technology community. Not exactly approaching it from this angle, but from another broader angle, perhaps. So the technology community, going back to Isaac Asimov, talks of the wisdom gap. And the wisdom gap, if I'm going to put it in economist's term, is that technology outruns our institutions or norms. So given the speed with which AI is taking place, I think there is a real concern in that regard. And our institutions are possibly at their weakest. Now, you can counter-argue and say they also looked very weak at the time of the progressive era. The Senate was up for sale. Senators were not directly elected. There was no income tax. There was no antitrust. Many media outlets were controlled by billionaires, and the economy was becoming very concentrated. And somehow the progressive era happened and was very quick and was very effective and completely changed the face of regulation, antitrust, inequality in the United States. Yes. So that's why I think I wouldn't say that there is no hope. But I also think that the degree to which independent civic action was possible in the progressive era may be much more than what it is today.
Okay, and don't answer my second question.
I want to answer it because it's very important, actually.
No, I had another question, which was you said,
I want to answer the second one.
Okay. Well, I'll give you another one, and then you answer both of them. The second question was, you showed the thing about the world, and you said that, look, in these other countries, they need a lot of jobs, etc., etc. They need a lot of jobs for sure, but they also need a lot of education and health and things like that. Now, you could actually say, and I know that the report that Gaurav has just produced a draft of has convinced me that, look, what the potential for AI on the side of making better education more accessible, better health, better public services, better administration, etc., all of those things, the potential for that in AI is massive, okay? So it may well be true that you get short-term effects on employment that are then actually somewhat better, and you actually get longer-term effects on the distribution of human capital, which is actually much better as a result of it. I'm not talking about rich countries like the US. I'm not even talking about Turkey and so on. I'm talking about countries.
Well, because Turkey has no hope, so that's good that you're not talking about Turkey.
Most people. Turkey has hope. Actually, Haishan just reclassified Turkey as a high-income economy this year, just so you know. Okay. Anyway, but you know, the thing is, it may well be the case that it actually helps these countries a lot more because half of the people or more sometimes live in rural areas, and for them, this is a huge boon. You can do in a decade what might have taken otherwise more than a century. There you go.
Okay, so I had a train of thought related to your second question.
I purposely confused.
Okay, I'll come back to that because actually my answer to your second question was related to the first one. So let me just briefly say that so that you know, I personally have nothing against billionaires so far as we do not create a two-tier society and billionaires don't become politically very influential. And, you know, in Sweden there are billionaires and they don't seem to distort the process of democracy that much. But in the United States, this extreme concentration of wealth has been very problematic. But more importantly, I think another reason why, in contrast to what you said, I would be not as optimistic about us closing the wisdom gap or finding the right direction is that when there is, from history, when there is a self-appointed elite that is so confident of its own intelligence and wisdom, that is a sure recipe for disaster.
Are you talking about MIT or are you talking about Silicon Valley?
I was talking about Silicon Valley, but MIT and Silicon Valley together. So that we can come back to that. That's not the last word on it, obviously. But yes, 100%. I think one of the great promises of AI is actually improving productivity in the service economy. One of the major contributors to that disappointing TFP performance in the United States, and same is true for Europe, is that we've had no productivity gains in healthcare and services in general. So if AI can reverse that, it can really have a big impact. But I think our track record isn't super inspiring. So let me give you some snippets. First of all, the digitization hasn't produced any productivity gains in healthcare or education. So there are so many studies on introducing computers, introducing tablets, etc., in classrooms. Not much. I mean, some of them find positive effects, but more find negative effects or zero effects. With AI, I think the way you do it is really first order. So now the first bunch of studies are coming out from AI in classroom, and the results are just horrible. So for example, there is a large-scale study in China which shows that when students use AI for homework, there is almost a 1 standard deviation worsening in their general knowledge. So the way that you're going to use AI is going to be very important. Now, true, if the alternative to AI is no teacher whatsoever, and you can get AI to some of the poorest villages in India or Africa, perhaps that's better. But again, I think the complementary AI path is using that so that we can actually improve services in other ways as well. So we can train teachers better. We can have productivity gains that can then be used for building more schools, etc. So I think there is an alternative path that is better, and there is a danger that if we use AI incorrectly and perhaps the genie's out of the bottle, the results could be pretty disastrous.
Got it. So guys, we can take, if you just go to that mic and just get in behind Norman and ask your questions, make them rapid fire, and we leave it to Daron to answer. Yeah.
Hello, Daron. I am Norman Loaiza. Good to see
Of course
you.
I know you're Norman.
And thanks for highlighting the risks of AI. I have one question related to the possibilities for coordination. I think AI is perceived by governments, by people, by firms as a weapon of massive influence and power. So in that context, I think the incentives are for every government, every firm, and every person to actually get the weapon and use it. If you regulate those that are willing to be regulated, which are usually the good guys, good governments, maybe good institutions, then you will regulate them, they will obey, but the only outcome is that the bad guys will not be regulated, and they will use AI in the worst possible way. So I'm really skeptical regarding this conclusion that coordination is feasible. So maybe we can have a policy in a different direction, maybe taxes, and maybe making labor less cumbersome for firms to employ. Maybe that's the direction that would be most sensible.
He wants a second amendment for AI. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Hilary Johnson. I appreciated that you talked about the social externalities. I'm curious, there wasn't anything on environmental externalities, and I haven't seen much in the literature where social externalities and environmental externalities are combined, thinking about, potential productivity gains offset against, increasing energy prices, increasing water scarcity, et cetera, and even thinking about the distributional impacts of these things. So, you talked about the distributional impacts of wage impacts, but what about also who pays higher energy prices and has to absorb, the increasing pollution or challenges related to water scarcity? And do you know of anything there, either in the pipeline or any studies that kind of combine these two elements? Thank you.
Should I answer these two first and then take two more?
Take two more.
Okay, take two more and then
One more. Take one more, and I'll give
Okay.
you the next one.
But I have two questions. Hi, my name is Selin Özgürt, another Turkish national. And thank you for all the refreshing point of views. I'll be the AI optimistic just for the sake of exchanging arguments. And it was very interesting, these social negative externalities. But I'm thinking how much automation in manufacturing is transposable to services. I mean, the jobs that AI would replace are junior consultants, assistants, like they are in the services sector, and most of those folks have already bachelor or even not master degrees. So are they going to suffer from teenage pregnancy or get opium addicted, or are they easier to scale up or leverage the complementarities you mentioned? And the second point is on emerging countries. When you need to adopt a new technology in manufacturing, you need to bring all the material engineers, know how it works, all that capital. But when you look at AI, that's the cheapest way. I'm not saying all emergings, but take Ghana, Pakistan, Rwanda. Those countries are really innovating already. They have big service sectors. And they can just simply get a subscription to ChatGPT or cloud and all that. And it's wonderful, actually, when you look at from that point of view. So what are your take on this?
Good question. Okay, go ahead. These three questions, if you can remember them.
Okay, yeah, I will try to remember. So, Norman, that is certainly a consideration. As is constituted, AI control, of course, is power. But the current framing of the AI race as an existential one where, if US good players don't do it, China, the bad players, would, is, in my opinion, both wrong and motivated reasoning. So that's been very much pushed by the AI industry itself. And it is bolstered by this belief that we are at the cusp of artificial general intelligence and then artificial superintelligence. If indeed that's the case, not only the CHIPS Act, which for other reasons might or may not be justified, but all sorts of other things would be justified, and there will be zero room for collaboration between China and the US because we are locked into a zero-sum existential game. That's why I sometimes say if China didn't exist, Silicon Valley would have had to invent it. But the reality is that, although there is a very pernicious use of AI in China for surveillance and repression, China is getting many things right. There is a lot of room for mutual exchange of information. And regardless of that, the AI problem is global, and you need to have global rules and global direction. And sort of cutting off that and going into a zero-sum competition is very costly. Now, indeed, if the artificial superintelligence within the next 5 to 10 years is a correct prediction, you might still justify that. But then we'll go back to the same thing that was the underlying theme here, that, I think AGI is neither an obvious direction, nor that inevitable, nor perhaps that likely that quickly. But again, different people are going to reach different conclusions there. In terms of the environmental effects of AI, well, let me say glass is half full and half empty. So on the half full part, first of all, I think the water use effects of AI are completely bogus. That was just based on an incorrect article, incorrect calculations. There is no major water stuff from AI, so far as I understand. Electricity or energy is a real issue and does create a price effect, as anything would. But if we, for example, had the correct social cost of energy with carbon taxes, that by itself may or may not be a problem. So, in other words, if we were pricing energy correctly for Anthropic and OpenAI, I would still worry about what they're doing for the reasons that I've articulated, but I wouldn't worry about it for the energy reasons. Now, the fact that in the United States at least, and in some other countries, and China included, firms don't pay the full social cost of energy makes that a relevant consideration. So I agree with you. What makes that much more glass half full, half empty, is that, and I understand, I learned that from Anya, you call this small AI, but domain-specific AI has much lower energy costs. And many of the pro-worker AI things that I mentioned could be achieved, although there's a debate on that as well, with domain-specific AI, in which case the energy cost wouldn't be as much of an issue. But for large language models, they would continue to be an important consideration. In terms of the first comment from the third questioner, that's another idea that's often floated by people from Silicon Valley, that somehow AI is going to be democratizing because it's going to replace jobs by more highly paid workers. There is very little evidence for that. First of all, if you look at many jobs that are at the crosshair of the AI, customer service, there are 3.5 million customer service representatives in the United States. And if there's one occupation that's going to get massively automated, that's customer service. They're not very highly paid. Back office jobs are not very highly paid. But more importantly, in the research that I did with Pasquale Restrepo, when we looked at the previous waves of automation, what we find is that when workers are displaced from their jobs, they then go and take jobs from the next layer of skill. So if there is displacement of junior managers, they're not going to become unemployed. They're going to go and take jobs from other people, and it's again the burden is going to fall on more lower paid workers. So I'm not optimistic that this time will be much better implications in terms of AI. And service, yeah, anything's possible. I think that's what Indermeet was also talking about. But again, I think there is a path of much better outcomes in the service industry from AI, but I'm not sure that we'll actually get there automatically.
Excellent. So we'll take 3 more questions. There are two comments on the web, actually 3 or 4. Most of them are asking for your slides, and we should make them available. The other comment from Emma Hobson, she says, she actually has a question. The OpenAI Foundation has recently announced $250 million in grants for partnerships on work towards ensuring that AI makes people's lives better. Should the World Bank be partnering with OpenAI? Don't these guys have like horns on their heads? That kind of thing?
First of all, I think the OpenAI Foundation is not identical to identical to OpenAI. It is obviously shaped by OpenAI. There are lots of overlaps, but it is run independently. And I think they have about $1 billion that they're going to invest. So yeah, if you can take some of it, do it. I mean, I would suggest anybody who is a left-winger, and if Heritage Foundation will give you a grant, why not take it?
Okay, you guys go ahead, ask your questions.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. My question is more regarding I was thinking about that particular figure, and isn't that we're missing perhaps the consumer side of things? So we look at that figure and we say, oh yeah, clearly the textile revolution didn't go well for weavers. But on the flip side of that same figure, you had people being able to buy cheaper clothes, right? Like today, no one considers you're rich because I bought 10 t-shirts. Whereas in the 1800s, maybe, yeah, to say yes, you probably needed to be rich, right? So couldn't it be the case that under this revolution, even if some things don't go nice for everyone, on the flip side, there are people who are getting cheaper products or services in, I don't know, I mean, if it's only reducing the price of yachts, then I get the point. But like if you're reducing the price of things that are generally bought by average people, couldn't there be a case like, listen, there is still a benefit for people who are just like average and not necessarily multi-billionaires in Silicon Valley? Thanks.
Yeah. And the same thing is true in case of jobs lost in the Midwest, but essentially China supplies products much cheaper all across the world. Maria Marta, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is, what policy instruments would you use to induce the company to develop pro-worker AI? And how would you know what the companies are doing behind closed doors? And then imagine you actually succeed in the US, but these companies compete globally. And they have every incentive for that reason to do something that is not pro-worker. So how would you handle these things with policy? Thank you.
Very good. Good question.
Thank you for that presentation, Professor. So my question is about aligning complementarities. I would like to ask more specifically about taxing tokens, for example, taxing hyperscalers, taxing compute. Would that help in that alignment? And also if it is viable to treat AI companies more like public utilities, having the history of electricity and railroads, other utilities where public ownership and public oversight is more important.
To take these three questions.
No, why don't we take this last one?
Thank you. It's two part questions. One is on demographics and the other is on governance. So demographics, like a lot of countries we're working on the last few years are obsessed with aging, especially young countries are aging faster than before. And now they were obsessed with pronatalism. And now they're coming back and asking us, do I need much people now as I wanted before? So what's the growth, like any thoughts on that? Because that's a running question.
Great.
The other one is on governance, and it's based on like the public utility one. Is it better to control AI by like allowing or encouraging like software engineers to unionize and because they are the most capable to actually control the AI than the companies, or the new idea of like just nationalize these companies right now? Thank you.
Okay, great. Lots of interesting questions. So,
And that was the last question. But just by the way, Daron is going to be here again next month, so we can ask him more questions then. Okay, go ahead.
but I won't talk about AI. Once is enough. So let me start with the first question, and then I think three questions are all related, so I'll take those together. So you're absolutely right. This picture here, and I can't see the person who asked that question. Oh, there, yes. You're absolutely right. This picture here leaves the possibility that other groups are benefiting. However, under the assumption that we measure CPI or whatever price index you use well, real wages deflated by CPI should be a good measure of what's happening to the welfare of wage earners. Capital income is different, and then you have to add the capital income as well. But imagine what would happen, for example, that T-shirts get cheaper. That reduces the CPI. So that boosts the incomes, net real incomes of everybody, so that will be reflected in the wages. Now, the question is, of course, we don't measure CPI well, and that the same CPI doesn't apply to everybody. So, for example, in the context of the China shock, there is an argument that the imports from China reduce the prices of goods that lower income people consume more, in which case you have to sort of not just look at the effects on the wages. And then you also always have to look at general equilibrium effects. You know, did China shock create more jobs in Seattle, for example, which wasn't particularly affected by China directly? So there are a bunch of issues. I would still say that despite all of those mismeasurements, which existing estimates say aren't huge, the performance of real wages in the US tells a pretty grim story. And if we have massive displacement of workers, even if capital income increases, that's not going to be enough. But more discussion is necessary there. On policy, there are many issues being raised there. But let me make 3 points in the interests of brevity. The first one is that more important than policy, I think, is a clear social consensus around what it is that we want from AI and what it is that we could get from AI. So in some sense, the policy discussion is important, but the Pope got it right by trying to change the conversation. So we need to change the conversation. If a change in conversation ultimately impacts the industry, that's the most effective way in which you can change the direction of research. And that is partly because no policy is super effective, and partly because of the point that you raised, which is that identifying pro-worker AI is hard and it will never be perfect. Now, the same problem afflicted green technologies. And we haven't been able to do that very well either. That's why a significant fraction of subsidies from the Biden administration went to oil companies. But in the area of the energy transition, we knew what policies to use: regulation, carbon tax, and innovation subsidies. So roughly speaking, those are the levers. But in addition, you can use competition, you can have antitrust policies so that the business models that are currently prevailing don't become dominant. None of them are going to work perfectly, but all of them would be much more effective if there is a change in the narrative and the norms surrounding AI. Part of the reason why they won't work right now is the majority of people in the AI industry are convinced that they're doing God's work and what they're doing is either inevitable or for the best of humanity. And there isn't a kind of a alternative narrative that's very powerful. So if you put some policies and they're convinced in their convictions, then they're going to try to find ways of going around them. And I think that's the reality of it. Some of the policies that the third question or the fourth question mentioned, sorry.
No problem.
Such as token taxes, compute taxes. I think we have to think broadly about all of these things. But there are some economic principles that we should sort of adhere to. So in economics, you have to think of two kinds of uses of taxes. One is Pigovian taxes. You tax something because it's creating externality or social effects, and you want to regulate the direction or the usage of it, versus you tax things because you want to raise revenue. The current proposals are confusing the two. So as my talk illustrates, I am very worried about the direction of AI, and there could be, and there are, Pigovian taxes that you can think about. But you shouldn't confuse those with taxes that will raise revenue. You don't put Pigovian taxes to raise revenue. If you want to raise revenue, you should do it via income taxes, or you can follow President Trump and take an equity stake in these companies that doesn't distort what they're doing. If you think what these companies are doing is wrong, then you should have a well-reasoned discussion about what it is that they're doing wrong and how it can be corrected, and those will be the basis of Pigovian taxes. I'm not saying that you cannot justify token taxes with that, but it's not an immediate justification, and I don't think that's the debate that we're having right now.
Very nicely put. So, as I'm listening to you, Daron, I'm thinking about like maybe 20 years back when we had Danny Roderick talking over here about the effects of globalization. At that time, he was talking about globalization, which is the China, effect and so on. And I remember that we always took Danny seriously, but not seriously enough. We didn't take him seriously enough because he kept saying that, look,
literally, but not seriously.
So he was saying that the speed at which these jobs were disappearing from a very concentrated part of the United States, not accompanied by compensatory social transfers or other things, maybe not for the workers but for their children and so on. We didn't take it seriously enough, I think, and so I think it's very good that we have Daron over here, actually telling us about this, because it may well be that we will the fact that we will listen to you and we will make the adjustments. So
very unlikely, but
so we'll be smarter this time than when Danny was talking about those things. Anyway, thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for bringing.
Thank you. Great seeing you.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I'll be back in 2 weeks. Or 2.5 weeks.
Yeah, it's more like 3, no?
Of course. Happy. What's your name?
Alice.
Yeah. Usual spelling.